Hi everyone, thanks for joining me this evening. Tonight we're going to be discussing how to make the skirt tabs that go on 17th century doublets. Now, sometimes they're big, sometimes they're small, but what we really want to keep in mind is that we want to avoid creating tabs that have corners which curl outward. So often you'll see these beautifully made doublets and then you see these skirt tabs along the bottom that seem almost like they're an afterthought, and they don't really possess the same kind of attention to detail with tailoring that the rest of the garment does. So we're going to look at how to pad them slightly with maybe a little bit of wool, how to shape them so that the corners curl inward towards the body, and how to line them to give the lining just a little bit of extra tension so that they curl towards the body as well. All of these different steps are designed to make the tab sort of structurally sound so that it doesn't have a tendency to curl outward at all. Okay? So let me get the rest of the room set up and we'll get started. Thanks so much for joining me tonight. So what you'll need to work on the tabs is you'll need the silk portion, you'll need an interlining cut out of heavy linen canvas. Now your exterior can be wool, it can be silk, it can be whatever fabric it is that you're working on right now. And then the interlining needs to be a heavy linen. We have wool Melton. It's a coat weight wool. It's usually been felted or fulled a little bit, so it's very dense. It's got a good structure to it. It's not particularly stretchy at all. It works well as a stiffener. Handkerchief weight linen or whatever linen you're using for your lining textile. Because of how these tabs are made, I tend not to cut the lining before the tabs are put together. The lining is sort of the last thing that I do for them because the shape is going to change, the size is going to change, the thickness will change, and it's just easier to cut the lining out once the exterior is already done. So I've got my iron set up here. Now my ironing board is actually just a wooden board. It's just a wooden board covered with a piece of wool. And you'll find if you do any research on traditional tailoring techniques that this is the setup that they tend to use. So I'll have a zoom in on this in a moment. I am just going to press my silk, get it nice and crisp and flat. I'm just going to take this little scrap of Melton right here and I'm going to lay. I'm going to do it double layered, it'll be faster. And just double cut. Going to just lay my wedge right along the selvage edge right there. And then I'll grab some scissors. Okay, so we're going to set that aside. And now I'm going to take my linen away. Then I am going to use a piece of chalk, and I'm just going to chalk in sort of a fat ½ inch, like maybe 5/8 of an inch, or 1.5 centimeters from the edge, and then I will trim that away. I'm going to leave it up at the top because I want that bulk for extra support at the top of the tab. And now I'll take my linen canvases here, and I'm going to lay right onto it. Flip this one over, do the same thing, just like that. The next step is going to be to start pad stitching them in place. I'll be doing this pad stitching with a plain linen thread. It's this, the linen weight is a 40/2, which means 40 wraps per inch, and it's 2-ply. I'm going to use a fairly coarse needle because this is pretty thick thread and I don't want to really fight it. So in this instance, I'm not forcing any significant roll into the surface. I'm just keeping it flat, and I'm actually giving a little bit of a tug to the surface this way
planting with my pinky here and giving a tug here so that I'm putting tension in the layers. I'm securing this strength into the surfaces. If you consider pad stitching somewhat like charging a battery, the energy of the shifting of the layers, the tugging that you do on the fabric, or in the case of shaping, if you're going to roll it, that energy is stored by the stitches between the surface tension of the layers. So depending on what you're pad stitching and why you're pad stitching, the amount of energy changes, the directionality of the pressures that you put on it with the shifting of the layers, all of that plays a role in creating the shape that you really desire. And one final row, just right here along the edge. And that will be enough. Then I'll take it to the iron and then I'll give it a press. So you can see that it's already starting to curve. So we'll press it in a curve. Press it this way to help keep it secured. And then we'll press it this way. And you can see that it's really nailed in there, and that's what we want. We want that solidity. We're really locking that tension into the layers by treating these pad stitches as an energy storage device, and that energy is what maintains this piece in a curved position instead of flat. So the next step is putting this wool side down and then laying the silk on, and then we're going to baste the silk in place. Now, wool side down, here we have the silk on top. We're just going to align it. I'm going to start here, and we're going to treat this as a diagonal baste, which means it's relatively similar to what we just used for pad stitching. I have my index finger right along the edge of this wool so that I know when I take my stitch, I'm not taking the stitch to the outside of the wool. I want this stitch to go in the wool, and the reason for that is that I want both the linen and the silk seam allowances to be free to fold. And when they fold, if you look at this, when they fold, the layers shift. You see that linen layer is slowly starting to become more exposed as I fold it. We want that to happen so that we're not securing any excess tension on the outside of the piece. I'm all the way around now. So I'm going to clip and I'm going to rethread my needle. Look at how significant that curve is though. So these basting stitches that we just put in, those will eventually be removed. So don't worry about how tidy they are. These stitches that we're putting in now, these are permanent. So notice I'm folding this up and I'm securing it. The needle is definitely going into the wool, but it's not going any deeper than the wool. It just needs to be secured. There's the linings going in on top of this, and that means that I'll have even more stitches securing everything. As I reach this corner, I'm going to plant my needle here. I'm going to fold this up. So it's hard to do a miter corner on this, a perfect miter, because it's an acute corner. I just need it to be tight. I don't need it to be perfect. We're folding everything in on itself. This bulk, by the way, this helps to keep the point from curling outwards. You don't want to trim the canvas away because then you're losing your meat out of the corner of this tab. If you look, again, if you look at surviving doublets and the extant tabs, you see that they're very substantial at the edges and at the corners. They're thick. Now we are at the end. I'm securing this stitch. Okay, and then I can break it. All right. If I flip this over, you can see this nice tab. Now I'm going to take this to the ironing board. Here we are at the iron. I have my tab. And I am going to remove this basting now before I press it, because if I press it with that basting in place, then I'm going to see the lines of all of those stitches. So the basting is gone. And now I'm going to press it. We're now nice and flat. Everything is clean. And we've got a good looking tab there. Very happy with that. So the next thing I'll show you is how to put the trim on. And I've got a needle threaded with a matching thread. Now this thread is a little bit heavier than what you would typically use for machine sewing, close to what you would use for like jeans top stitching. It's that weight. So the stitch that's using here, I'm actually just doing this with a running stitch that's sort of spaced a little far apart, just down the center. And turning the corner is a little tricky. I'm just giving an extra back stitch right there to secure everything in place. And then we'll go along the bottom. And as I'm working, you'll see that I am curling the fabric, and as soon as I get a little bit further, I'm going to curl it even more tightly. So this is the same principle as what we were doing on the inside of the garment. We're storing the energy of the surface tension difference between the surface of the fabric and this piece of trim. And what it does is it makes sure that we're not pulling the trim too tight, which would then also defeat the purpose of trying to make the tab curve towards the body. You can cut that off. So now I'm going to do the second round of trim, for which I will need a fresh piece of thread. So we'll go right next to the first one with just a teeny tiny bit of the surface of the fabric showing through between them. So you can see that's what we're going for. Just a sliver of orange between these two pieces of trim. They should be right on top of each other almost. All right, I'm at the corner, so I'm doing my little back stitch technique so that I can really get in there but make sure that it's secure. And then I'm going to turn the corner. Okay, just a few stitches in one place. And done. And the tab still has that feeling that it wants to curve. Okay. So now we are going to make the tab lining. It's just this piece of linen. This is double layered because at some point I will have two of these that need to have the lining put into them. So this scrap, the grain line is almost irrelevant because surviving garments really seem to show that they just cut them out of whatever scrap was available. So I have this here and I've just laid it in place. I've got, I'd say probably 3/8 of an inch, you know. Okay, so I've just cut the piece out and left a little bit of margin around the sides. All right, so the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of one of the layers because I don't need it yet. So I've got that. Now I'm going to get the lining positioned this way. This I'm going to just do quickly with pins. Typically I will baste things, but I also know that people like to use pins. So I'm going to put a pin in here, and this is through all of the layers. I'm putting a pin in here. Really just those two is all that I actually need. And then I'm flipping it over, and then I'm just going to fold the linen back leaving a little margin. Just put one there. We'll do one here at the bottom in the center, because really I can fold this back as I work. So just put this in the center so that I have a guide. And then I'll do the far side as well. Now there is a technique to this. So I'm doing this. Now we've already, when we pinned from the outside, we made sure to pin while it was in a curved shape, because again, we're trying to make sure that we keep everything curving towards the body. So you can see as I'm reaching this corner here, I've got this little bit like that. I'm just going to tuck it away inside. Doesn't need to be anything more dramatic than that. Just tucked away inside, and then I'll put a pin in the corner. Okay. Keep it from doing strange things. I mean, look how thick that is along the edge. That's almost 1/4 of an inch when all is said and done. For something that looks so thin and flat, and for something that we tend to make so thin and flat when it comes to historical clothing, it's really quite substantial. Here we are, the lining pin in place, and we're ready to do the stitching. All right, so I'm going to take, I have my needle threaded again in a color that matches. I'm going to take my needle underneath the layers here, and I'm going to come out through the silk and up through just a little tiny bit of that lining. Okay, now I often use a felling stitch to apply a lining. Some people like a pick stitch. I think in this case I'll use a felling stitch because it seems to be more prevalent in surviving garments that the tabs were lined using a felling stitch. So the felling stitch, if you look carefully, the needle is, see where the thread's coming out here? The needle gets inserted just above where that thread is, and it is angled between the layers, and then it comes out just slightly ahead of it. In this case, just a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch. So you can see that there's just the tiniest little divot, a little pick of fabric, or pardon me, a little pick of thread right along the top edge that encases. And as I approach the corner, you're going to see me kind of crunch it a little bit. And this is to use the lining to force even more tension into the corner. Again, thus making the lining just a tiny bit tight so that it forces the curl towards the body instead of towards the outside. Okay, so here I am all the way at the end. I'm taking 1, 2, 3 stitches in the same place, and then I'm going to leave the top open because if I need to trim that wool out on the inside when it comes time to stitch this onto the garment, I need access to that point. It is such a small opening, it's really not going to hurt anything to leave it open. So for now, I'm just leaving it there. I can remove these pins, and then I can cut my thread. And that's how you make a really nicely shaped skirt tab for a 17th century doublet. This thing feels like cardboard. Thanks so much for watching. Happy stitching, and have a good night.